The Italian peninsula, 8 centuries before the birth of Christ, a land divided yet alive with change. Smoke rose from hilltop villages where farmers worked the same fields their ancestors had plowed for generations. Tribes traded grain, cattle, and simple pottery in dusty markets, unaware that the world around them was beginning to shift. Two great cultures were arriving to reshape this ancient land. From the north, the Etruscans, mysterious and powerful, were carving cities into the hills, their stone walls and temples rising as monuments to engineering and faith. Their priests read the will of the gods in the flight of birds and the livers of sacrificed animals, guiding kings who ruled with divine authority. Their wealth glittered in bronze jewelry, painted tombs and banquets, where men and women reclined side by side, a scandal to more conservative neighbors. And from the south came the Greeks, bold seafarers who crossed the wine-dark sea to build colonies along Italy's shores. They brought their gods, their heroes, their myths, and their greatest gift of all, writing. Their temples stood white and elegant against the coastline, and their stories of Zeus, Heracles, and Achilles traveled inland, retold by merchants until the names became Roman: Jupiter, Hercules, and Mars. In the middle of this exchange stood Rome, still only a humble village on the Tiber. But its people watched, learned, and absorbed. From the Etruscans, they took the science of building and the art of kingship. From the Greeks, they took gods, myths, and letters. And from both, they learned the greatest lesson of all: to borrow, to adapt, and to make everything Roman. The Tiber River shimmered under the rising sun, its muddy waters carrying reeds and driftwood past the low settlement clustered along its banks. Farmers led their oxen into the fields, children chased each other along dirt paths, and smoke from clay hearths curled into the cool morning air. To an outsider, this was a simple world, unchanged for generations. But Rome was no longer just a sleepy tribal village. Its people were beginning to see themselves differently, not just as farmers, but as part of something larger, something shaped by powers greater than themselves. To the north, the Etruscans were building a world unlike anything the Latins had ever seen. Their cities, Veii, Tarquinia, and Cerveteri, rose proudly, their stone walls encircling markets filled with bronze, iron, and fine pottery. Streets were laid out in careful grids. Drainage channels carried rainwater away. Temples stood on high podiums, decorated with painted terracotta figures. The Etruscans had mastered the land itself, carving roads through hills and building with stone in ways that the Latins could only marvel at. For Roman traders, traveling to an Etruscan city must have felt like stepping into another world. Bronze mirrors reflected faces in flawless detail. Jewelry glittered with intricate patterns, and tools forged from iron were stronger than anything made in Latium. Every object carried a story, not just of wealth, but of knowledge. The Romans watched and learned, bringing these goods home, not just for their beauty, but for what they represented, a way of life more advanced than their own. The Etruscans also lived differently. Their banquets shocked their neighbors. For here, women reclined beside men, drinking wine and laughing freely. Women owned property, inherited wealth, and were celebrated by name on public inscriptions. To the conservative Latin tribes, this seemed almost scandalous, but to the Romans, it was a sign that power could be shared in ways they had not imagined. Centuries later, Roman matrons would hold a status far greater than their Greek counterparts, a distant echo of this early Etruscan influence. Religion guided every Etruscan decision, and this too fascinated the Romans. Priests interpreted the will of the gods in lightning strikes, bird flights, and the entrails of sacrificed animals. A haruspex would lift a sheep's liver, tracing its veins as though reading a divine map, while augurs stood on hills, staffs raised to the sky, watching birds cross invisible lines drawn in the air. Nothing important was done without these rituals, and soon Rome adopted them. Kings would not hold council, armies would not march, and buildings would not be raised without first seeking the gods' approval. But the Etruscans were not the only influence shaping this young city. Southward, beyond the fertile plains, Greek sails appeared on the horizon. Greek colonists founded cities like Cumae, Sybaris, and Taras, bringing with them not just trade, but culture. Their painted pottery, traded north by Etruscan merchants, showed scenes of heroes battling monsters, gods feasting on Olympus, and warriors clashing before the walls of Troy. These stories captured Roman imaginations, retold in Latin dialects until the heroes themselves became Roman. Heracles became Hercules, worshipped by farmers and soldiers as a god of strength and protection. Zeus became Jupiter, the king of a new Roman pantheon. The Greeks brought their alphabet too. The Etruscans learned it first, adapting the letters to their own language, and from them, the Romans borrowed it again. At first, Latin inscriptions were simple, names scratched into pottery, short dedications to gods. But it was a beginning. Rome had discovered writing, and with it, the power to preserve laws, treaties, and history. Trade connected all these cultures, weaving the peninsula into a single network. Etruscan merchants carried Greek goods north, Roman farmers sold grain and livestock south, and markets across Italy buzzed with voices speaking Greek, Etruscan, and Latin all at once. Every transaction was an exchange not just of goods, but of ideas, beliefs, and customs. Rome stood at the heart of this web, quietly absorbing it all. The Romans were not innovators, at least not yet, but they had a gift that would shape their destiny, the ability to borrow, to adapt, and to transform. From the Etruscans, they took urban planning, engineering, and rituals of kingship. From the Greeks, they took myths, gods, and letters. And from both, they learned how to make everything serve their own ambitions. The 8th century before Christ was drawing to a close, and Rome was no longer just a village by the Tiber. It was becoming something greater. The lessons of the Etruscans and Greeks were taking root in its soil, ready to grow into a power neither culture could have foreseen. The age of borrowing was not over, but already Rome was beginning to shape its own identity. The pupil was watching closely, learning quickly, and preparing for the moment when it would no longer need teachers. That day was coming, and when it arrived, Rome would rise, not as a student, but as a master. The Tiber River flowed quietly through the heart of Latium, its muddy waters carrying driftwood and reeds past the low settlements along its banks. Rome was still little more than a village, its huts made of wattle and daub, its people farmers and herdsmen who traded simple goods with neighboring tribes. But change was creeping ever closer. Etruscan merchants moved southward with caravans of bronze goods, and Greek traders carried stories of strange gods and magnificent cities. Rome stood between these two worlds, and it would not remain untouched for long. Etruscan influence was felt first and most strongly. Their power radiated from their city-states like ripples across a pond. Veii, only a day's journey from Rome, towered over the surrounding countryside with its strong walls and bustling markets. Here, skilled artisans hammered bronze into mirrors polished to a flawless shine, sculpted elegant candelabra, and forged iron weapons sharper and stronger than anything the Latins had ever wielded. Etruscan traders brought these goods south, and Roman chieftains, eager to display their status, began acquiring them. The weapons improved Roman warfare, the ornaments changed Roman fashion, and slowly, the prestige of Etruscan culture seeped into Roman life. But the influence went far deeper than objects. The Etruscans brought organization. Their cities were not just larger than anything Rome had seen, they were planned, carefully arranged for efficiency and control. Roads cut straight through their urban centers, drainage systems carried away waste, and temples stood at the highest points, visible for miles around. The Romans watched, and when they later began to build their own city in stone, they would follow this same model: walls, roads, central temples, and public squares. Religion, too, reshaped Rome. The Etruscans believed that every action, every decision of war, every construction of a temple, even the founding of a city, required the approval of the gods. Their priests, experts in interpreting divine will, became advisors to kings and generals alike. Roman leaders would later adopt this practice so completely that no public decision in Rome could be made without consulting augurs or haruspices. Even the Roman Senate, centuries later, would not open its sessions without first asking the gods for permission. The rituals themselves were fascinating and strange. A haruspex would stand before a crowd, lifting a freshly sacrificed sheep's liver for inspection, his fingers tracing its ridges as he whispered prayers. If the liver was smooth and unmarked, the gods were pleased. If it bore spots or deformities, the gods were angry, and no action could proceed. Augurs would take their place on a high hill, marking the sky into sections with a staff, and waiting for birds to fly by. The direction of the flight, the species of the bird, even the way its wings moved, all were messages from the heavens. The Romans adopted these practices with almost no change, carrying them well into the imperial age. But perhaps the most lasting Etruscan gift to Rome was political. The Etruscans ruled their city-states under kings, and this model found its way to Rome as well. Roman tradition holds that some of Rome's earliest kings, including the powerful Tarquin dynasty, were of Etruscan origin. Whether this is entirely true or not, Etruscan political ideas certainly shaped Rome's early monarchy. Kings ruled with both religious and military authority, just as Etruscan rulers did, and early Roman insignia of power, such as the purple-bordered toga, the curule chair, and the ceremonial bundle of rods called the fasces, were borrowed directly from Etruscan customs. While the Etruscans exerted their influence from the north, the Greeks continued to spread their culture along the southern shores. Their colonies were growing fast, linked by trade to the wider Mediterranean. Greek merchants brought amphorae filled with wine and oil, decorated with black figure and red figure art depicting gods and heroes. These were not just luxury goods, they were glimpses into a new way of seeing the world. To the Italic peoples, the Greek cities must have seemed like something out of myth themselves. Cumae, with its strong walls and bustling harbor, was a center of trade and learning. Sybaris became so wealthy that its name would one day become a byword for luxury. Taras, founded by Spartan settlers, trained its youth in the disciplined ways of Greek warriors. Italic and Etruscan traders visited these places, returning home with new ideas as well as new goods. The Greek alphabet, in particular, changed everything. Writing spread northward as traders carved letters into clay tablets and scratched them onto pots to mark ownership or dedications to the gods. The Etruscans adopted these letters, modifying them for their own language, and the Latins learned from them. By the late 8th century BCE, the first Latin inscriptions began to appear, simple words, names, or dedications scratched into pottery. It was the first step toward the written laws, treaties, and histories that would one day define Rome. The Greeks also brought philosophy, though at this early stage it was not yet studied in depth by the Italic peoples. Instead, their myths captured the imagination. Tales of Zeus, Hera, Heracles, and Achilles spread across the peninsula, sometimes carried in song, sometimes painted on pottery. These stories blended with local Italic legends, creating new interpretations. Heracles became Hercules, a symbol of strength and endurance, admired by soldiers and farmers alike. The supreme Greek god Zeus merged with native Italic sky deities to form Jupiter, who would later sit at the head of the Roman pantheon. These were not mere copies of Greek gods, they were transformed, reshaped to fit Italic beliefs and customs. Even architecture felt the pull of Greece. The sight of a Greek temple with its tall columns and triangular pediment inspired awe. The Etruscans were quick to adapt these designs, but they changed them to suit their own tastes, making the temples heavier and placing them on high podiums. When the Romans eventually began building stone temples of their own, they inherited this hybrid style, a blend of Greek elegance and Etruscan grandeur. The cultural exchange was not just one way. Etruscans traded iron, timber, and grain with the Greek colonies, sending caravans south while Greek ships brought back luxury goods and fine art. Intermarriage between Etruscan nobles and Greek merchants was not uncommon, and local Italic tribes were drawn into the network of trade and shared rituals. In markets across the peninsula, one might hear Greek, Etruscan, and Latin spoken side by side as merchants bartered and storytellers recited myths to gathered crowds. And through all of this, Rome stood quietly, absorbing everything. The Latins were not innovators, not yet, but they were observant. They learned how to organize cities from the Etruscans, how to write from the Greeks, how to interpret omens from foreign priests, how to honor gods with grand temples. Most importantly, they learned how to take these ideas and make them their own. By 700 years before Christ, Rome was still small, its population perhaps only a few thousand, but the foundations were being laid for something far greater. The Romans were becoming masters of adaptation, and in that skill lay the secret of their future empire. The Etruscans had taught them how to build. The Greeks had taught them how to dream. Soon, the Romans would take these lessons and forge them into something entirely new, something that was neither Etruscan nor Greek, but Roman. The air over Latium carried the scent of damp earth and smoke as Rome's early morning life stirred to motion. Farmers led oxen to fields beyond the hills, traders rolled carts toward the growing markets, and craftsmen hammered away at simple tools in workshops lit by flickering oil lamps. Life for most Romans still revolved around the cycles of farming and trade. But something deeper was changing. The city, though still small, was beginning to think like a city-state. The lessons taken from its powerful neighbors were no longer distant curiosities. They were beginning to take hold in daily life. The Etruscans, with their advanced cities and rituals of power, were leaving their mark most visibly. Their influence reached into the political heart of Rome. Roman kings were no longer just leaders of tribes. They were kings in the Etruscan style, rulers who carried themselves as symbols of divine order. The purple-bordered toga, the curule chair, and the lictors carrying fasces became common sights in public ceremonies. These were not just decorative customs, they were statements of authority. They told the people that their king ruled not merely by family loyalty or strength, but by the will of the gods. This divine approval was sought in every action, just as it was in Etruscan cities. Roman priests carefully learned the art of interpreting the gods, adopting Etruscan augury and haruspicy almost exactly as practiced in the north. Augurs now stood on Roman hills at dawn, marking the sky into sacred sections and waiting for birds to fly across them, while haruspices examined the livers of sacrificed animals, whispering prayers as they traced each ridge. No building was begun, no war declared, no treaty signed without first asking for these signs. The Romans would perfect this ritual discipline over time, turning it into a central part of their state religion, but its roots were Etruscan. The Etruscans also shaped the physical growth of the city. Rome's marshy lowlands, once left untouched, began to be drained, a skill learned from Etruscan engineers who had long mastered the art of reclaiming wetland. Simple channels carried water away toward the Tiber, opening land for future markets and gathering spaces. Though still primitive compared to the monumental Cloaca Maxima that would one day dominate the Forum, these early drainage projects signaled a shift in Roman thinking. The land could be reshaped to serve the needs of the city. Meanwhile, Roman craftsmen were experimenting with new techniques learned from Etruscan artisans. Bronze and ironworking improved as tools and weapons became sturdier and more effective. Decorative objects, once plain, began to imitate Etruscan styles, with fine brooches, pins, and ornaments appearing in the homes of Rome's wealthier families. A Roman noble might now drink from a cup decorated in the Etruscan fashion, or display a polished bronze mirror. But Rome's cultural transformation did not come only from the north. To the south, Greek influence continued to flow inland through trade routes and Etruscan intermediaries. Greek colonies like Cumae and Sybaris prospered, their goods traveling north in caravans and ships, painted pottery, elegant in its black figure or red figure designs, reached Roman markets, its scenes of gods and heroes telling stories that had never before been heard in Latin tongues. These myths spread quickly, adapted by storytellers who recited them around fires or in busy marketplaces. Heracles became Hercules, his strength and endurance making him a favorite among farmers and soldiers who admired hard work and perseverance. Zeus became Jupiter, his character reshaped to embody Roman ideals of law, authority, and stability. Even Ares, the Greek god of war, merged with Italic deities to become Mars, the stern and disciplined protector of Rome. These gods were no longer Greek, they were Roman, molded to reflect Roman values. The Greek alphabet, already adapted by the Etruscans, also found its way to Rome during this time. Latin inscriptions began to appear, scratched into pottery or carved into stone. They were simple, names, dedications to gods, marks of ownership. But they represented a monumental change. Rome had discovered writing, and with it came the ability to keep records, make treaties, and preserve traditions. For a people whose identity would one day depend on written laws, this was the beginning of a revolution. Social customs also showed subtle signs of change. Among the Roman elite, feasts grew more elaborate, influenced by the banquets of the Etruscans. Men reclined on couches as they ate, copying the style of their northern neighbors, while women, though still far more restricted than in Etruscan society, began to appear more often in public gatherings. These changes were small, but they reflected a slow, steady shift toward a society that valued public life and social display as much as private duty. The military, too, was evolving. Rome's early warriors, once loosely organized into tribal warbands, were adopting Etruscan methods of warfare. Iron swords and shields replaced older, weaker weapons, and basic formations began to replace chaotic charges. Roman leaders learned to organize their fighters into more disciplined groups, though still far from the professional legions of later centuries. These early changes gave Rome an advantage over neighboring tribes, allowing it to secure trade routes and defend its growing markets more effectively. Trade itself was flourishing, bringing Rome wealth and connecting it to a wider world. Etruscan merchants carried Greek goods northward, while Roman farmers sent grain, livestock, and timber south. Markets grew busier, filled with the hum of bargaining and the mingling of languages. A Roman trader might bargain in Latin with an Etruscan merchant who spoke a few words of Greek, exchanging goods and unknowingly exchanging ideas. Through all these changes, one thing remained constant: Rome's unique ability to adapt. Other Latin tribes were also exposed to Etruscan and Greek influence, but none absorbed it as effectively as Rome. The Romans did not imitate blindly. They borrowed what worked, discarded what didn't, and reshaped everything to suit their own needs. Etruscan religion became Roman state ritual. Greek gods became Roman protectors. Foreign engineering techniques became Roman infrastructure. By the end of the 8th century before Christ, Rome was no longer just a quiet village on the Tiber. Its kings ruled with growing authority. Its priests conducted rituals with increasing precision. Its markets bustled with foreign goods, and its people spoke of gods and heroes that connected them to a wider world. The city was still young, still small compared to the great Etruscan and Greek centers, but it had begun to find its identity. The Tiber flowed past its growing markets, carrying goods to distant shores, but it also carried something far more important: the ideas, beliefs, and ambitions that were shaping Rome's future. The Romans were no longer just students. They were beginning to build their own legacy. The lessons of the Etruscans and Greeks had taken root, and soon they would grow into something neither culture had expected. The pupil was learning fast, and soon it would be ready to rise. The Tiber carried the soft reflection of the morning sky, as Roman fishermen cast their nets from the muddy banks. The city was still humble, its huts clustered along the hills, but its people were changing. The quiet confidence of farmers was giving way to the ambition of merchants and leaders who now looked beyond their own fields and rivers. The lessons learned from their neighbors were no longer distant curiosities. They were becoming tools for transformation. To the north, Etruscan power was reaching its height. Their city-states, organized and wealthy, glimmered like jewels across the hills of Etruria. Veii, with its high stone walls, was a symbol of their engineering mastery and political authority. Tarquinia, famous for its elaborate painted tombs, displayed scenes of feasts and dances that spoke of a life of refinement. The Etruscans thrived on trade, their forges burning day and night as craftsmen shaped iron into weapons and bronze into ornaments. These goods flowed southward, carried by caravans that passed through Latin lands, leaving behind not only objects but new ways of life. Rome was no longer untouched by these changes. Its leaders welcomed Etruscan merchants, exchanging grain, livestock, and timber for tools, weapons, and decorative goods. A Roman noble family might now own a bronze mirror, a luxury once unheard of, or wear a brooch fashioned in the Etruscan style. But these objects carried more than beauty. They carried influence. Every traded item whispered of a more advanced world, one that Rome was eager to join. The transformation of Rome was not limited to material wealth. The Etruscans brought ideas about how to rule, how to build, how to honor the gods, that reshaped the way Romans thought. In Etruscan cities, nothing was done without consulting divine will, and Roman leaders began to adopt the same practices. Augurs stood on Roman hills, staffs in hand, marking the sky and waiting for birds to cross their invisible lines. Haruspices studied the livers of sacrificed animals, their fingers tracing the same patterns Etruscan priests had followed for generations. For the Romans, these rituals were more than borrowed superstition. They were a way to claim legitimacy, to show that their actions were sanctioned by powers greater than themselves. The influence of Etruscan kingship deepened as well. Rome's monarchy began to mirror Etruscan rule, adopting symbols that projected authority. The king now wore the purple-bordered toga, sat on a curule chair during public ceremonies, and moved through the streets flanked by lictors carrying fasces, bundles of rods with an axe, representing the power to punish and execute. These symbols, once foreign, became part of Roman identity, enduring long after the monarchy fell. To rule Rome was now to embody the state itself, just as Etruscan rulers embodied their cities. Architecture, too, began to change. The Etruscans taught the Romans how to build with stone and how to shape the land to suit their needs. Drainage systems were introduced to reclaim marshy ground, a skill that would one day allow the construction of the forum in what was once swamp. Early Roman builders experimented with arches, following Etruscan models, learning how to make structures stronger and more durable. Even in its modest beginnings, Rome was laying the groundwork for the monumental city it would become. While the Etruscans shaped Rome from the north, the Greeks continued to influence the peninsula from the south. Their colonies grew into thriving centers of trade, and their cultural influence spread inland through Etruscan intermediaries. Greek pottery, with its scenes of gods and heroes, became a common sight in markets far from the coast. These images inspired new stories, retold in Italic dialects until they no longer sounded Greek at all. Hercules replaced Heracles in Roman tales, and Jupiter took the place of Zeus, though his character was reshaped to suit Roman ideals of power and justice. The gods were changing. Writing, too, was transforming Roman life. The Greek alphabet, adopted by the Etruscans and passed to the Latins, gave Romans the power to record their words. Early inscriptions were simple, names carved into pottery, short dedications to gods, but they were revolutionary. A people who could write could record treaties, laws, and histories. The Romans were only beginning to grasp the significance, but the tools were now in their hands. Trade bound all these influences together. Greek merchants brought wine, oil, and luxury goods into Etruscan markets, and from there they traveled to Rome. Roman farmers exchanged grain and livestock for foreign wares, and with every transaction, foreign ideas slipped quietly into Roman life. In the markets, one could hear a mix of languages. Greek spoken alongside Etruscan and Latin, as people bargained, shared stories, and learned from one another. Rome itself was beginning to reflect these changes. The huts on the hills were still simple, but some now had stronger foundations, inspired by Etruscan building methods. Public spaces were becoming more organized, as pathways widened into open areas where markets and gatherings took place. The city was no longer just a cluster of family dwellings. It was slowly turning into a community with shared rituals, shared spaces, and shared ambitions. What set the Romans apart was not just what they borrowed, but how they used it. The Etruscans and Greeks influenced many peoples of Italy, but only Rome seemed determined to weave these lessons into a single identity. The Romans were selective. They took what worked, adapted it, and discarded what did not fit their character. They turned Greek myths into Roman legends, Etruscan rituals into Roman state religion, foreign tools into Roman weapons. The process was slow, but it was steady, and it was shaping a people who would soon demand more than survival. They would demand greatness. By the middle of the 7th century before Christ, Rome was no longer a passive observer of the world around it. Its leaders were forming alliances, its merchants were trading beyond the Tiber, and its priests were interpreting omens with growing authority. The city still lacked the wealth and splendor of Etruscan and Greek centers, but it was no longer just a hilltop village. It was becoming something more. A city with ambition, a city learning to stand among the great powers of Italy. The rivers, the roads, the trade routes, everything now carried ideas as well as goods, and Rome was ready to use both. The age of borrowing was far from over, but already Rome was learning to transform what it borrowed into something uniquely its own. The seeds planted by the Etruscans and Greeks were taking root, and soon they would grow into something neither culture could have imagined. The 7th century before Christ unfolded with Rome, slowly stretching beyond the limits of a mere village. The smoke rising from its hills no longer came only from farmers' hearths, but from workshops where craftsmen shaped tools and pottery, inspired by techniques learned from neighbors. The chatter in its markets grew louder, mixed with foreign words from traders, who now considered Rome a small but useful stop along the routes that connected north and south. The city was changing, but quietly, carefully, absorbing every lesson it could. The Etruscans remained the strongest influence. Their city-states stood as shining examples of wealth and power. Their leaders ruled with a dignity that bordered on the divine, combining religious authority with political strength. Roman kings were eager to imitate this model. The monarch of Rome was no longer simply the first among tribal chieftains. He had begun to take on the trappings of Etruscan royalty. The purple-bordered toga became a mark of his office, the lictors with fasces a symbol of his right to command. These emblems, once foreign, now marched openly through Roman streets, signaling that Rome was no longer merely Latin in its customs. The impact of Etruscan kingship extended beyond symbols. The Romans began organizing their city with greater structure, adopting Etruscan methods of administration. Early assemblies of elders grew into more formal councils, influenced by the political order of Etruscan cities. Religious offices took on new importance, with augurs and priests becoming key advisors to the king. The rule of Rome was becoming less personal and more institutional, laying the groundwork for the political systems that would come after the monarchy. Etruscan engineers continued to leave their mark on Rome's physical landscape. The low-lying marshes between the hills, long a breeding ground for disease, were gradually being drained, a skill borrowed directly from Etruscan practice. Channels were dug to redirect stagnant water toward the Tiber, opening space that would one day become the Roman Forum. Early wooden bridges began to span the river, improving trade and communication with neighboring regions. Though simple compared to the engineering marvels that would come later, these first steps showed a new Roman confidence in reshaping the land to meet human needs. Religion was becoming deeply embedded in Roman life, shaped heavily by Etruscan practices. Every public decision, from declaring war to choosing the site of a new building, was preceded by omens. Priests studied bird flights, lightning strikes, and the entrails of sacrificed animals, just as their Etruscan teachers had done. To Roman citizens, this was not mere superstition, but proof that their leaders acted with the approval of the gods. Over time, these rituals became so formalized that they formed a permanent part of Roman law and custom. While the Etruscans shaped Rome's political and religious world, the Greeks continued to shape its imagination. The southern colonies were flourishing, their harbors crowded with merchant ships, their markets brimming with luxury goods. Greek pottery reached Rome through Etruscan trade, carrying with it stories painted in vivid detail. Achilles chasing Hector, Heracles wrestling beasts, Odysseus outwitting his enemies. These tales, retold in Latin, began to influence Roman values. Hercules, admired for his strength and endurance, became a symbol of the kind of hero Romans respected. Practical, courageous, and loyal to duty, Greek gods slipped into Roman worship, but they did not remain entirely Greek for long. Zeus became Jupiter, a god of not just storms, but of law and order, fitting Roman ideals of leadership. Hera became Juno, protector of marriage and the state. Apollo, god of healing and prophecy, was worshipped for his practical benefits, a typical Roman approach to religion. Unlike the Greeks, who often questioned their gods through philosophy, the Romans valued them for what they could provide: protection, guidance, and prosperity. The spread of writing was another Greek gift that was quietly transforming Rome. The Latin alphabet, adapted from the Etruscan version of the Greek script, was now being used for more than just names or ownership marks. Inscriptions began to appear on religious dedications, boundary stones, and even treaties between tribes. Rome was learning to document its agreements, an ability that would later become one of its greatest tools for administration and control. Trade continued to expand, knitting the peninsula together. Etruscan merchants carried Greek goods north and Latin goods south, and Roman traders began to take a more active role in these exchanges. Grain, livestock, and timber from Roman lands were traded for wine, oil, and fine pottery. Markets grew busier, filled with the sounds of bargaining in multiple languages. For the first time, Rome was not just receiving goods, it was participating in the wider economic network of Italy. Social life was changing as well. The wealthiest Romans began to adopt Etruscan-style banquets, reclining on couches as they dined, imitating the feasts depicted in Etruscan tomb paintings. While still far simpler than the luxurious gatherings of Etruscan nobles, these meals marked a shift toward a more refined and public style of social life. Roman women, too, gained subtle freedoms influenced by Etruscan customs. Though not as independent as their Etruscan counterparts, they appeared more frequently at public gatherings, a sign of slow but significant cultural change. Rome's military traditions were also evolving. The Etruscans, skilled in both warfare and fortification, influenced Roman tactics and weaponry. Roman warriors began using stronger iron weapons and sturdier shields modeled on Etruscan designs. Battles with neighboring tribes became more organized, fought under clearer chains of command. Rome was still far from the disciplined legions of the future, but its first steps toward a professional army were being taken during this time. All these changes, political, religious, economic, and military, were weaving together into something new. Rome was no longer just a Latin village. It was becoming a city-state shaped by two great cultures. yet it remained distinctly Roman, even as it borrowed freely. The Romans had a gift for adaptation, but they were not imitators. They selected what was useful, discarded what was not, and reshaped everything to fit their own character. By the end of the 7th century before Christ, Rome stood at a threshold. Its population had grown, its trade expanded, its kings ruled with increasing authority. The city was beginning to think not only of survival, but of ambition. Surrounded by Etruscan power and Greek influence, Rome had learned from both, and it was ready to take its first steps toward becoming a power of its own. The Tiber carried more than just goods now. It carried the dreams of a city preparing to rise. Rome was still small, still young, but its future was no longer uncertain. The lessons of the Etruscans and Greeks were firmly rooted in its soil, and soon those roots would grow into something entirely new, a Roman identity, ready to claim its place in history. The days of quiet observation were fading. Rome was no longer just a student sitting at the edges of great civilizations. It was beginning to test its own strength. The lessons absorbed from the Etruscans and Greeks were not lying dormant. They were being applied, reshaped, and forged into the beginnings of a distinctly Roman way of life. The city was changing before the eyes of its people. Markets that once traded little more than grain and livestock now bustled with goods from across the peninsula. Bronze ornaments from Etruscan workshops, finely painted Greek pottery, and tools forged with advanced methods passed from merchant to merchant in Rome's growing marketplace. The city's leaders encouraged this trade, understanding that wealth meant power. Roads were being cleared and improved, inspired by the straight, efficient routes of Etruscan engineering, connecting Rome more closely to its neighbors. The political life of Rome was also becoming more sophisticated. The kings, influenced by Etruscan models, ruled with an authority that stretched beyond simple tribal loyalty. They acted not just as war leaders, but as guardians of the state, blending religious duty with political power. Ceremonies became more elaborate, reinforcing the image of the king as chosen by the gods. The presence of lictors carrying fasces through the streets was not just symbolic. It reminded the people that Rome was no longer a loose confederation of families. It was a city with a central authority. Religion continued to shape every public decision. The gods were consulted before any major action, and priests held a respected place in society. Augurs watched the skies for signs before armies marched or treaties were signed, while haruspices read the livers of sacrificial animals to determine divine approval. These rituals, learned from the Etruscans, became more formalized, recorded carefully by Roman priests who were already showing the Roman tendency toward order and system. What had begun as borrowed customs were now becoming uniquely Roman traditions. But religion was not the only sphere where Greek influence was quietly at work. Stories of Greek heroes and gods, told first through trade and then through local storytellers, were reshaping Roman values. Hercules, admired for his perseverance and strength, became an ideal Roman hero, embodying the virtues of labor, sacrifice, and service to the greater good. Shrines dedicated to him began to appear along trade routes, where merchants and travelers offered prayers for safe journeys. Greek gods found their way into Roman worship, but as always, the Romans changed them to suit their own character. Apollo was revered for his healing powers and his oracles, while Minerva, adapted from the Greek Athena, was honored for wisdom and craft, virtues deeply respected in a society that valued both practical skills and discipline. The Roman pantheon was becoming a patchwork of Italic, Etruscan, and Greek deities, but under Roman hands, they formed a single, cohesive system. The changes in religion reflected a broader truth. Rome was becoming a hybrid of cultures, yet it remained distinctly itself. The Etruscans and Greeks influenced many peoples of Italy, but only Rome had the ability to combine these influences into something new. The Romans were not content to simply imitate. They selected, refined, and made every borrowed custom serve their own needs. Social life reflected this growing confidence. Roman banquets began to imitate the reclining style of Etruscan feasts, where men and women dined together, though Roman customs remained more conservative. Roman women appeared at public gatherings more often than before, a subtle change influenced by the greater freedoms enjoyed by Etruscan women. Among the elite, education began to include lessons in reading and writing, skills adapted from the Greek alphabet, but reshaped for Latin speech. Literacy was still rare, but its presence in Rome marked another step toward a society that would one day depend on written laws and records. The military, too, was evolving. The Etruscans were skilled warriors, known for their organized battle formations and strong fortifications. Roman leaders learned from them, adopting stronger iron weapons and sturdier shields. Tribal war bands were slowly becoming more disciplined, with clearer leadership structures and more organized tactics. Though still far from the professional legions of later centuries, Rome's military was beginning to take on the characteristics that would make it formidable: discipline, adaptability, and relentless determination. Trade continued to expand, weaving Rome more tightly into the economic network of Italy. The Tiber River, once a local lifeline, now served as a vital trade route connecting Rome to both Etruscan cities to the north and Greek colonies to the south. Merchants from distant lands brought not just goods, but stories, customs, and even languages. In Roman markets, one could hear a mix of Latin, Etruscan, and Greek, all spoken in the same busy square. This growing exposure to the wider world began to shape Roman identity. The people of Rome started to see themselves not just as Latins, but as part of something larger, something connected to the great cultures that surrounded them. Yet even as they borrowed, they took pride in their own traditions. Roman farmers continued to value hard work, discipline, and loyalty to family and state, virtues that would become the backbone of Roman society for centuries. By the mid-7th century before Christ, Rome stood at an important turning point. It was no longer merely a follower. It was beginning to act as a participant in the political and cultural life of Italy. Alliances were forged with neighboring tribes, conflicts were fought to secure trade routes, and Roman kings began to think not only of defense, but of expansion. The city's leaders had learned from their Etruscan and Greek neighbors, but now they were applying those lessons in ways that served Roman ambition. The transformation was not yet complete, but the direction was clear. The Rome of simple farmers was becoming the Rome of traders, soldiers, and leaders. Its people were no longer just observers of the world's great powers. They were The Tiber continued to flow past the city's growing markets and workshops, carrying goods to distant ports, but it also carried something far more powerful: the ideas, beliefs, and ambitions that were turning Rome from a small hilltop settlement into a city-state with a future. The foundations of Roman greatness were no longer being laid by others. They were now being built by Rome itself. The pupil was becoming the craftsman, shaping its own destiny with the tools its neighbors had provided. Soon those tools would be used to carve out an empire. The sun rose over the hills of Latium, spilling golden light across the Tiber as the city of Rome stirred awake. Merchants prepared their stalls, craftsmen hammered at bronze and iron in their workshops, and farmers drove carts loaded with grain and olives into the bustling markets. This was no longer the quiet Rome of generations past. The city had grown larger, more organized, and more ambitious. Its leaders spoke now of alliances, trade routes, and fortifications. Its people, once content with the rhythms of farming life, had begun to think of themselves as citizens of a rising city-state. Rome's transformation was visible everywhere. Streets, once little more than worn dirt paths, were being shaped into defined routes, inspired by the Etruscan love for order and planning. Marshy lowlands had been drained to make room for new gathering spaces, and markets had expanded, bringing together traders from across the region. Etruscan builders had helped guide these changes, but Romans now oversaw the work themselves, learning to manage their own public projects with a growing sense of independence. The influence of Etruscan kingship still lingered strongly. Rome's rulers embraced the ceremonial grandeur of Etruscan monarchs, continuing to wear the purple-bordered toga and sit upon the curule chair during important assemblies. The fasces carried by lictors remained a powerful symbol of authority, reminding every citizen of the king's right to command and to enforce order. Yet Roman kings were beginning to show their own distinct style of leadership. Unlike the often lavish and aristocratic Etruscan rulers, Roman kings increasingly balanced grandeur with practicality, valuing efficiency and the loyalty of their people as much as divine favor. Religion retained its central role, woven into every decision of state. Before new buildings were raised or armies were sent into battle, priests carefully read the signs. Augurs stood on hills, scanning the skies for the flight of sacred birds, while haruspices traced the marks on sacrificed livers, seeking the will of the gods. These rituals, rooted in Etruscan tradition, had become deeply Roman in character. Where the Etruscans viewed the gods with a sense of fearful mystery, the Romans approached them with pragmatism. The rituals were precise, the prayers formulaic. If the proper steps were followed, the gods would grant their favor. It was religion reduced to order and method, reflecting the practical Roman mind. Greek influence, meanwhile, continued to shape Rome's imagination. Greek stories had become familiar to the Romans, retold so many times that they no longer felt foreign. Hercules, now firmly Romanized, was honored not just as a hero of myth, but as a protector of travelers and merchants. Small shrines to him dotted the trade roads, where traders paused to leave offerings before continuing their journeys. Minerva, adapted from the Greek Athena, was worshipped for wisdom and craft, her image carved into early Roman statues. Apollo's name was spoken in prayers for health and healing. The Greek gods had been adopted, but they had been given new roles shaped to fit Roman values. The adoption of the Greek alphabet had begun to yield deeper changes as well. Rome was still far from being a literate society, but inscriptions were becoming more common. Traders marked goods with names and symbols, priests recorded omens and rituals, and treaties with neighboring tribes were occasionally scratched into stone or bronze. Writing gave Rome something it had never had before, a memory that could last beyond a single generation. The ability to record agreements, laws, and religious practices would soon become one of the most important tools of Roman power. Social customs, too, reflected the blending of cultures. Among the elite, banquets grew more elaborate, inspired by Etruscan feasts, though they retained a distinctly Roman sense of restraint. Men reclined on couches, and women, who now appeared more often in public gatherings, joined them in conversation. These changes were gradual, but they hinted at a society beginning to move beyond the old tribal restrictions. Education, though still limited, was slowly spreading among wealthy families, where children learned to read and write simple words, opening the door to a future where knowledge would be valued as highly as strength. The military was perhaps where the greatest transformation was taking place. Rome's early armies had been little more than war bands, organized by family ties and led by local chieftains. But exposure to Etruscan tactics and weapons was changing that. Roman soldiers now carried stronger iron swords and heavier shields, and their leaders began to adopt more disciplined formations in battle. Conflicts with neighboring tribes were fought with increasing organization, and Rome's victories, though still limited, gave its people a new sense of pride and unity. War was no longer just a matter of survival. It was becoming a tool for expanding influence. Trade continued to connect Rome to the wider world, making the city wealthier and more diverse. The Tiber served as a lifeline, carrying goods north to Etruscan cities and south to regions influenced by Greek colonies. Markets thrived, filled with the scent of foreign oils, the gleam of bronze, and the chatter of merchants bargaining in multiple languages. A Roman farmer might trade his grain for an Etruscan-crafted brooch, while a Greek merchant, speaking broken Latin, exchanged fine pottery for livestock. These markets were more than economic centers. They were classrooms where Romans learned about the world beyond their hills. This constant flow of goods and ideas began to shape how Romans saw themselves. They were no longer simply a small Latin tribe. They were a people standing at the crossroads of great cultures. They had Etruscan roads beneath their feet, Greek myths in their stories, and a growing sense of their own place in history. The Romans were beginning to see their city, not as a follower of others, but as a future equal to the powers that surrounded them. The character of the Roman people was forming in these years. From the Etruscans, they had learned organization, engineering, and respect for divine order. From the Greeks, they had taken myths, art, and the first tools of written language. But what truly defined them was their ability to take these influences and forge them into something new. Where the Etruscans clung to their traditions and the Greeks looked down on foreigners, the Romans embraced change, reshaping every borrowed idea to serve their own goals. By the late 7th century before Christ, Rome was beginning to act with growing confidence. It formed alliances with neighboring communities, fought small wars to secure trade routes, and began to speak with a louder voice in the politics of the region. The city was still young, still learning, but its ambition was no longer hidden. The people who once watched and imitated now planned and built, making decisions not just for survival, but for growth. The hills of Rome, once home only to farmers and herdsmen, now echoed with the sounds of hammers, traders, and soldiers drilling in formation. The city was alive with purpose, and its future was no longer merely a dream. The Etruscans and Greeks had given Rome the tools, but Rome was beginning to wield them with its own hands. The transformation was far from complete, but the course was set. Rome was no longer a pupil sitting quietly in the corner of history. It was a young power learning how to stand. Soon it would learn how to lead. The 7th century before Christ drew to a close with Rome standing on the edge of transformation. The city that had once been little more than a cluster of huts on the Palatine Hill was now a true settlement of ambition and order. Its leaders ruled with symbols of authority borrowed from the Etruscans. Its priests consulted the gods with rituals refined by centuries of tradition, and its markets echoed with voices speaking in Latin, Etruscan, and Greek. Rome was still small, still young, but it had changed forever. The Tiber River carried ships and rafts loaded with grain, timber, wine, and pottery. Roman farmers walked through markets where foreign goods gleamed under the morning sun. Etruscan jewelry, Greek amphorae, painted with scenes of gods and heroes, and tools forged with methods unknown to older generations. Merchants bargained, artisans displayed their work, and children listened to travelers' tales of distant lands. Rome had become a meeting place of cultures, and its people were absorbing every lesson. The political life of the city reflected this new confidence. The king, now dressed in the purple-bordered toga and attended by lictors with fasces, was more than just a tribal chieftain. He was the representative of Rome itself. Councils of elders debated matters of trade and war, and priests stood beside them, reading omens to ensure divine approval. Every decision, from the building of a new bridge to the negotiation of an alliance, carried a sense of purpose. The city's leaders no longer thought only of their own families. They thought of Rome as a whole, as something greater than any individual. Religion remained at the center of this growing identity. Rome's gods were no longer only the simple deities of fields and rivers. They had become a diverse pantheon, combining Italic spirits, Etruscan rituals, and Greek myths into a single ordered system. Hercules was honored at shrines where merchants prayed for safe trade journeys. Jupiter, now fully established as Rome's supreme god, embodied not just the power of the sky, but the authority of kings and the laws of men. Minerva was revered for wisdom and craft, and Apollo was invoked in prayers for health and healing. Rome had taken the gods of its neighbors and reshaped them into protectors of its own destiny. The military, too, reflected this growing ambition. Roman warriors trained with iron weapons modeled on Etruscan designs, their shields sturdier and their formations more organized than before. Battles with neighboring tribes were no longer just struggles for survival. They were fought to secure trade routes, resources, and influence. Though still small in scale, these early conflicts taught the Romans valuable lessons in discipline and strategy, lessons they would one day perfect on battlefields across the Mediterranean. Society itself was shifting. Roman elites dined in Etruscan style, reclining on couches during feasts, though Roman modesty kept these gatherings simpler than their neighbors. Women began to appear more often at public events, reflecting subtle Etruscan influence, while education slowly spread among the wealthier families. Children learned to write their names in the Latin alphabet, adapted from the Greeks, scratching the first letters of a language that would one day be spoken across an empire. Trade continued to connect Rome to distant cultures. Etruscan caravans passed through its streets, carrying Greek goods northward, while Roman farmers sent their grain and livestock south to coastal markets. In this constant exchange, Rome was not only trading goods, it was trading ideas, absorbing customs, and shaping them into something uniquely Roman. What truly set Rome apart, even in these early years, was its ability to take from others without losing itself. The Etruscans had given Rome its first kings, its engineering techniques, and its rituals of divination. The Greeks had given Rome its gods, its alphabet, and its first taste of written culture. But Rome did not simply copy, it transformed. Every borrowed idea was reshaped, refined, and fitted into the Roman way of life. The city was learning the skill that would define it for centuries, the ability to adapt and absorb the best of every culture it touched. By the dawn of the 6th century before Christ, Rome was no longer the quiet pupil it had once been. Its leaders were beginning to think in terms of power, its people in terms of destiny. The hills that once sheltered farmers and herdsmen now held a community ready to stand among the great powers of Italy. The Etruscans and Greeks had been the architects of this transformation, whether they knew it or not. Their cities, their myths, their gods, and their engineering had shaped Rome's early identity. But now, Rome was becoming something new, something neither fully Etruscan nor Greek, but Roman. And that Roman identity would soon rise to shape the world. The sun set over the Tiber, casting long golden reflections across the river, as merchants packed their goods and soldiers returned from drills. The city was alive with purpose, filled with the sounds of hammers, the murmurs of priests, and the laughter of children running through the narrow streets. Rome was still small, still young, but it was no longer a mere collection of huts on a hill. It was becoming a city, a power, and, one day, a legend. The age of learning was ending. The age of Rome was about to begin.